Imagine waking up in a world where childhood doesn't exist, where men, women, and even children work 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, where families live crammed into tiny, dark tenements while the richest men in the country dine in palaces just blocks away, where every breath is heavy with smoke, dust, and desperation. This was America in the 1880s. But this isn't just history, it's the story of real people struggling, surviving, and shaping a nation from the shadows of factories, farms, and crowded streets. Stay with me, because what you're about to see will change the way you think about life in America forever. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step, don't skip it. There is no alarm clock, only the slow gray light of dawn pushing through a thin window pane. The air smells of coal smoke, damp wood, and iron. Somewhere nearby, a factory whistle screams, not to wake you gently, but to command you. Time no longer belongs to the sun or the seasons, it belongs to machines. This is an America standing at a crossroads, half rooted in soil, half shackled to steel. For many Americans, life begins before sunrise and ends long after sunset. Work is not a choice, it is survival. In cities like New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis, men, women, and children pour into factories that roar like living beasts. The air inside is thick with dust and danger. Fingers are lost to gears. Lungs fill with cotton fibers or coal ash. Injuries are common. Compensation is not. There are no safety regulations, no weekends, no minimum wage. A 12-hour workday is normal. A 14-hour day is not unusual. And when the body finally gives out, there is no pension waiting, only poverty. Children work too. Boys barely tall enough to see over machines crawl beneath spinning belts to clear jams. Girls stitch garments until their eyes burn and their backs curve forward too soon. Childhood is brief, often non-existent. Education is a luxury many families cannot afford. And yet, hope persists, fragile but stubborn. Across the Atlantic, ships arrive daily, heavy with human cargo. Italians, Irish, Germans, Jews from Eastern Europe, Chinese laborers, each carrying dreams stitched together by desperation and belief. They arrive at ports clutching small bundles, speaking unfamiliar languages, convinced that America is a place where hard work might finally be enough. But the America they meet is not gentle. Immigrants crowd into tenements, dark, airless buildings stacked with families. One room may hold 6, 8, even 10 people. Water comes from a shared pump. Toilets are communal. Disease spreads easily, tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid. Death is common, quiet, and frequent. Still, families endure. Mothers stretch meals thin. Fathers send money back home. Communities form in tight spaces, bound by shared struggle and shared language. Churches, synagogues, and mutual aid societies become lifelines. Faith is not merely belief, it is survival. Beyond the cities, another America exists. In the countryside, farmers rise with the sun, tied to land that promises much and delivers little. The soil is unforgiving. Droughts come without warning. Prices fall while railroad fees rise. Farmers grow food for a nation, yet many cannot afford to eat well themselves. Debt hangs over them like a permanent storm cloud. Railroads dominate the land, cutting through fields and towns alike. They symbolize progress, steel lines binding the nation together, but they also represent power concentrated in the hands of a few. Railroad barons set prices, farmers pay or perish, and towering above all of this are the industrial titans, names spoken with awe and resentment. Men who build empires of oil, steel, rail, and finance. Their mansions glitter with marble and gold. Their dinner tables overflow. They speak of progress, efficiency, and destiny. Some believe sincerely that wealth is proof of virtue. Others simply believe wealth is power. The gap between rich and poor stretches wider each year. In the city's elegant theaters and grand department stores rise just blocks away from slums. Silk dresses pass starving children in the street. Luxury and misery exist side by side, separated only by awareness. Yet America in the 1880s is not silent. Workers begin to organize. Labor unions emerge, fragile but determined. Strikes erupt, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent. The demand is simple: shorter hours, safer conditions, fair pay. The response is often brutal. Police crack batons, soldiers fire rifles, workers are blacklisted, jailed, even killed. Progress, it seems, does not arrive without blood. Women, too, are pushing against the limits imposed upon them. They work in factories, teach in schools, organize charities, and begin to speak publicly for reform. The idea that women might deserve political power is still radical, but it is no longer unthinkable. African Americans, newly freed from slavery just 2 decades earlier, face a cruel betrayal of freedom. In the South, segregation tightens its grip. Voting rights are stripped away through violence and law. Sharecropping replaces slavery with another form of bondage, one built on debt and dependency. And yet, even here, resilience endures. Families build schools, churches, and businesses. Education becomes an act of defiance. Dignity becomes resistance. Technology reshapes daily life in subtle ways. Electric lights flicker into existence in some cities, turning night into something less final. Telephones shrink distances. Newspapers spread information faster than ever before, shaping public opinion and national identity. America is learning to see itself. It is loud. It is chaotic. It is unequal. It is unfinished. Life. In 1880s, America is not a story of simple progress or simple suffering. It is a story of contradiction, of hope rising from hardship, of cruelty walking beside kindness, of ordinary people carrying extraordinary burdens without knowing their names would never appear in history books. These are the people who wake before dawn, who endure, who believe, sometimes desperately, that tomorrow might be better than today. They are not heroes carved in stone. They are human. And through their labor, their sacrifice, and their persistence, they are quietly shaping a nation still learning what it wants to be, because the America of the 1880s is not yet a promise fulfilled. It is a promise being tested. In the 1880s, industrial America was a living, breathing engine that demanded more than it gave. Factories roared like iron beasts, their chimneys spitting black smoke into gray skies, and the streets outside hummed with the restless energy of men and women drawn to the promise of work. But the promise was often a cruel illusion. To step into a factory was to enter a world governed by the laws of machines rather than men. Time no longer belonged to the sun nor to natural rhythms of life. It belonged to the relentless ticking of the clock and the unyielding demands of industry. Work began before dawn, the chill of the morning air barely lifting before the whistle screamed across the city, summoning bodies not for choice, but for necessity. Inside, the air was thick with coal dust, fibers of cotton, and the acrid bite of chemicals, and the machines moved with a mind of their own, indifferent to flesh and bone. A single misstep could cost a finger, a hand, even a life, yet the work continued day after day, hour after hour, because survival left no room for hesitation. The people who powered these factories were ordinary Americans pushed to extraordinary limits. Men bent over spinning frames or heavy machinery, their muscles straining under impossible loads, often with no rest beyond the briefest of pauses. The workday could stretch to 12, 14, even 16 hours, and the compensation offered barely sufficed to feed a family, let alone provide for education or medical care. There were no safety nets, no minimum wage laws, no weekends. Every hour of labor extracted more than it gave back, and yet there was a resilience, a stubborn insistence to endure. Women worked alongside men in textile mills, garment factories, and food processing plants, their bodies subject to the same relentless rhythm. Their work often invisible in its value. They stitched seams that would clothe the nation, turned cranks that powered machines, handled raw materials that corroded their hands and lungs, all while remaining responsible for the maintenance of the home. The boundary between and the public and private spheres was erased by necessity, and exhaustion became a constant companion. Children, too, were drawn into this world at ages we now recognize as tender and fragile. Boys and girls barely tall enough to reach the pedals of a loom or the pulleys of a factory belt crawled beneath machines to clear jams, fetched materials from dangerous heights, and carried loads far heavier than their bodies should bear. Education was a privilege often sacrificed to the pressing need for income, and childhood itself was compressed into stolen hours before and after work, if it existed at all. The very concept of youth, of time to play and learn, was sacrificed on the altar of survival. The voices of children were often drowned in the clamor of engines, yet their labor was no less essential to the operation of the city's industrial heart. The factory became a crucible in which innocence was tempered by necessity, and every scraped knee or burned hand was a testament to the harsh realities of life in this era. The physical environment of the factories reflected the harshness of the labor within. Floors were slick with grease and water, stairs were narrow and treacherous, and ventilation was minimal. Heat, smoke, and fumes created oppressive conditions that few could endure without physical consequences. Eyes became red and watery from constant exposure to dust and fibers. Lungs ached with each inhalation of soot and ash. Skin bore the scars of burns and cuts. accident. S were not exceptions, they were inevitable. Yet compensation for injury was rare, and medical care, when available, was crude and costly. The workers were expendable to the industrial machine, their suffering invisible to those who profited from the output of their labor. Despite the relentless demands, factories also became a microcosm of community and social interaction, though one shaped by hardship. Workers shared meals in cramped break areas, exchanged whispered stories over the roar of machinery, and formed tentative alliances to endure the monotony and danger of their tasks. These relationships were fragile, tested by competition for jobs and wages, but they were also vital lifelines. Workers learned to rely on one another, finding moments of humor, solidarity, and quiet defiance in the spaces between shifts. It was a social fabric woven from exhaustion, perseverance, and the small triumphs of survival. Industrial labor in the 1880s also illuminated the stark contrasts of wealth and power. Factory owners and industrial magnates profited enormously from the toil of their workers, yet their lives were worlds apart from those who operated the machines. They dined in gilded halls, traveled in comfort, and made decisions that rippled across the lives of thousands without ever setting foot on a factory floor. Meanwhile, the laborers produced the goods that built the nation's wealth, yet their own conditions remained harsh, their voices largely unheard. The tension between and these worlds was palpable, simmering in silent resentment and occasional eruptions of anger. Strikes and labor disputes began to emerge, nascent attempts to challenge the imbalance of power, though they were met with violence, intimidation, and legal resistance. Yet for all the suffering and injustice, there was a quiet determination that defined the workers of this era. There was pride in skill and endurance, in the ability to maintain focus through hours of repetition, in the knowledge that each day's labor contributed to something larger than oneself. Families survived because of their effort. Communities endured because of shared sacrifice. The machines were not merely instruments of oppression, they were also the means by which hope could persist, however fragile it might be. Workers clung to the idea that persistence would eventually yield reward, that education, savings, or migration might offer a path to a slightly easier life for the next generation. The factories of the 1880s were more than workplaces. They were crucibles of modern American life. They shaped the rhythms of the day, the contours of cities, and the expectations of society. They were the engines of progress, but also the theaters of struggle, human cost, and resilience. To understand the industrial laborer of this era is to see the birth of modern America in sharp relief, its promise and peril intertwined, its achievements inseparable from the sacrifices made by ordinary people who bore the full weight of progress. The clang of machinery, the hiss of steam, the constant pulse of labor, these sounds defined the lives of millions. Men, women, and children navigated the perilous currents of industrial life, their bodies and spirits tested daily. The stories of their labor are etched not in marble or gold, but in calloused hands, aching backs, and quiet endurance. They were the lifeblood of cities, the pulse of industry, and the invisible architects of a nation still learning to balance wealth, power, and human dignity. In the 1880s, America was a magnet for those seeking a better life, a land whispered about in distant villages, across oceans, and along dusty roads where hope seemed to have little place. Ships arrived at ports like Ellis Island and Boston Harbor, packed with men, women, and children, carrying small bundles tied with thread, their eyes wide with both wonder and fear. They came from Ireland, fleeing famine and political oppression, from Italy, searching for work that might lift them from poverty, from Eastern Europe, where pogroms and persecution made survival precarious, from China, lured by rumors of opportunity and the distant promise of freedom. Each immigrant carried a story, a burden, a dream, and a determination that collided with the harsh realities of the cities they would enter. But the America they encountered was not the land of endless opportunity that stories had promised. It was crowded, chaotic, and unforgiving. Immigrants were funneled into tenements, tall, narrow buildings that rose like walls against the sky, housing families in rooms scarcely large enough to breathe. One room could hold 6, 8, sometimes 10 people, with children sleeping on the floor or sharing narrow cots. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Water was drawn from communal pumps in hallways. Toilets were shared among dozens, and disease spread with terrifying ease. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, and other illnesses stalked the streets and homes alike. preying on bodies weakened by long hours of work and insufficient nourishment. The air inside the tenements was thick with the smell of cooking fires, sweat, and unwashed clothing, mingling into an almost permanent haze that clung to hair and skin. Yet even in these cramped quarters, life carried on. Mothers cooked over small stoves, stretching flour and vegetables to feed children who returned from factory floors, sweat-streaked and exhausted. Fathers returned from work, sometimes injured, sometimes underpaid, carrying the weight of despair, but also of hope, knowing that their labor was the thin lifeline connecting their families to survival. Meals were often meager, yet they were prepared with care, a quiet assertion that life must continue despite the crushing weight of circumstance. The tenement was not merely a dwelling, it was a fortress of endurance, a place where culture, tradition, and identity were preserved amid chaos and neglect. Language, food, religion, and customs became bonds between neighbors as each immigrant group sought familiarity in an unfamiliar world. The smells of fresh bread from an Italian bakery mingled with the tang of pickled cabbage from a Polish kitchen. Yiddish phrases floated through narrow hallways alongside Italian and Gaelic curses, creating a cacophony that somehow became music to those who called these streets home. Churches, synagogues, and mutual aid societies emerged as lifelines, providing support for the sick, the unemployed, and the grieving. They were sanctuaries in a city that often seemed indifferent, places where faith was not merely belief, but a tool for survival. Festivals, prayer gatherings, and small celebrations offered moments of relief, instances when families could breathe and feel a sense of community, however fleeting. Work, however, remained the defining reality. Immigrants found employment in factories, sweatshops, and construction sites, taking jobs that many native-born Americans shunned. The work was grueling, often dangerous, and poorly compensated. Women labored in garment shops, sewing endless rows of clothing under harsh lighting and with minimal ventilation. Men dug trenches, laid bricks, or operated machinery in factories where injuries were common and safety almost non-existent. Children carried parcels, swept floors, or assisted older siblings, contributing to the family income in ways that robbed them of education and play. Hours stretched from dawn until long past dusk, leaving idle energy for leisure or reflection. Payment was small, just enough to pay rent, buy food, and keep a family alive for another day. And yet families endured, forging resilience from necessity. In the streets outside, the city pressed in with noise, filth, and competition. Street vendors hawked their wares, children darted between carts, and the smell of horse manure mixed with coal smoke to create an atmosphere that was both alive and oppressive. Crime was common, as poverty bred desperation, and immigrant neighborhoods were often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility by those who already held power. Prejudice was rampant. Irish Catholics faced nativist derision, Italians were dismissed as unskilled laborers, and Chinese immigrants endured both legal restrictions and violent attacks. Survival required not only physical stamina, but also cunning, community connections, and an ability to navigate a society that was often indifferent or hostile. Despite this, immigrants carried with them hope that transcended their circumstances. Letters from home, money sent across oceans, and the prospect of a future in which children could grow taller than their parents or read books that they themselves had never touched were motivators that drove them forward. Many saved every penny, took side jobs, and endured conditions that would break most spirits, believing that America offered a path, however narrow, to a life better than the one they had left behind. Generations were shaped in these tenements, where perseverance and grit became as essential as air and water. The tenements were also incubators of culture and identity. Italian opera societies, Jewish theater troupes, and Irish music gatherings transformed cramped hallways into stages for expression. Children played stickball in alleys, learning teamwork, strategy, and the rules of a society they were only beginning to understand. Markets became hubs of communication, where news from distant homelands mingled with American political developments, creating a dual consciousness that tethered immigrants to both the old world and the new. Education, when possible, was treasured. Night schools, Sunday classes, and makeshift lessons taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, often in English, a language many parents themselves could not speak. Knowledge became a weapon against poverty, a shield against marginalization, and a bridge to possibility. Yet the struggle was constant. Eviction threatened families who could not pay rent, fires could sweep through wooden tenements with terrifying speed, and sickness could decimate a household in weeks. Each day was a balancing act, a negotiation between survival and dignity. And in this struggle, immigrants were quietly reshaping America. They provided labor that fueled factories, construction, and railroads. They nurtured children who would go on to schools, offices, and new industries. They preserved traditions even as they adapted to a new society, creating a patchwork culture that would define American cities for decades to come. The story of the immigrant tenements in the 1880s is not one of despair alone. It is a story of courage, endurance, and hope clinging to the narrowest margins. It is a testament to the human capacity to survive under conditions that would seem insurmountable. Life in these buildings was harsh, unforgiving, and often tragic. Yet it was also alive with energy, determination, and the quiet victories of ordinary people carving out a place for themselves and for generations yet to come. In the 1880s, America was a land of startling contrasts. On one street, a child might scurry through mud and soot to reach a crowded tenement, hungry, exhausted, and unseen. A few blocks away, a mansion gleamed in sunlight, its marble steps polished, its chandeliers sparkling, and its halls echoing with the laughter of a family untouched by want. The gap between wealth and poverty was immense, not only measured in dollars, but in the very quality of life. The distance between comfort and deprivation, the gulf between influence and invisibility. The industrial elites, the men who controlled steel, oil, railroads, and finance, lived lives that seemed almost otherworldly compared to the laboring masses who produced their fortunes. They were the captains of an emerging empire, and their power reached far beyond factories, cities, or states. It stretched across the entire nation, shaping politics, culture, and the very perception of what America could become. These men, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and others, built fortunes of unprecedented scale. Steel poured from Carnegie's mills, oil flowed from Rockefeller's wells, railroads sprawled across the continent under the management of tycoons whose names were whispered with both admiration and fear. Their wealth allowed them to construct lives of opulence, grand houses filled with imported furniture, art collected from Europe, libraries brimming with books, and dining rooms set for feasts unimaginable to those who served them. Servants moved quietly through the halls, tending to every need. Their children were educated privately, groomed to inherit empires, and shielded from the rough realities faced by the city's working population. Even the clothes they wore were symbols of authority and taste, tailored and expensive, signaling not only wealth, but belonging to a rarefied class that seemed untouchable. Yet the foundation of this extraordinary wealth was often labor that was anything but luxurious. Factories ran with human energy extracted under brutal conditions. Miners, mill workers, and laborers toiled for 12, 14, even 16 hours a day, risking life and limb for wages that barely supported families. In the mines of Pennsylvania, men worked in dark, dangerous tunnels, inhaling dust and coal exposed to cave-ins and explosions. In the mills, children bent over machines that could crush hands and arms. Their labor generated the profits that allowed industrial elites to expand their holdings, accumulate more wealth, and consolidate power in ways that ordinary citizens could scarcely imagine. There was a clear, unspoken understanding. The comfort of the few rested upon the toil of the many. The industrial titans were not merely economic forces, they were political actors, shaping legislation, influencing elections, and defining the rules of commerce. Railroads were central to this power. Controlling the lines that transported goods across the nation, railroad magnates could set rates that determined the success or failure of farmers, manufacturers, and merchants alike. Monopolies and trusts emerged, allowing a handful of men to dominate entire industries, stifling competition and concentrating wealth further. The idea of survival of the fittest in economic terms became both a justification and a strategy. These men claimed that their success demonstrated vision, intelligence, and work ethic, while the plight of the laboring poor was dismissed as failure or weakness. Yet much of their advantage came from exploiting systems that left workers with little recourse, and from influencing governments that often prioritized property and capital over human life. The extremes of wealth and poverty created stark social contrasts. The streets of industrial cities were lined with luxury shops, theaters, and clubs catering to the affluent, offering entertainment and indulgence unimaginable to the families struggling to survive. Nearby, silk dresses brushed against children running barefoot. Expensive carriages clattered past tenements filled with filth and disease. wealth was visible, almost taunting, to those who could not access it, a daily reminder of inequality. Yet the presence of opulence also inspired both admiration and resentment, fueling debates about justice, fairness, and the role of money in society. Some celebrated the industrialists as self-made men embodying the promise of American opportunity. Others saw in their power a moral failing, a system that allowed a few to flourish while many suffered. Philanthropy emerged as a way to shape legacy and public perception. Carnegie, for instance, donated vast sums to build libraries, schools, and institutions, asserting a belief in the moral obligation of the wealthy to give back to society. But philanthropy could only do so much. It alleviated symptoms of inequality without addressing the structural forces that produced it. For every library, there were factories running 12-hour shifts, tenements collapsing under neglect, and children forced to labor for survival. The charitable acts of the elite were sometimes lauded, sometimes criticized, but they could not erase the fundamental imbalance of power that defined the era. Labor unrest began to rise in response to these inequities. Workers, increasingly aware of the disparity between their own suffering and the comforts of industrial elites, began organizing for change. Strikes, unio, NS, and labor associations emerged, demanding fair pay, safer working conditions, and shorter hours. Confrontations were often violent, met with armed police, private security, and even military intervention. Yet the desire for justice persisted, a growing recognition that the nation's promise could not be realized, while so few held so much and so many held so little. The industrial elite's power was immense, but it was not absolute. Collective action, even in its nascent form, represented the stirrings of a societal reckoning. Beyond economics, the power of these elites extended into culture. Newspapers, pamphlets, and social clubs were influenced by their interests. Education, art, and public opinion could be shaped to reinforce notions of hierarchy and success. The very idea of what it meant to be successful was tied to wealth and property, a reflection of the values of those who controlled the nation's resources. Ordinary citizens internalized these signals, measuring themselves against the lives they could never attain, while the industrialists' influence defined the possibilities available within American society. Yet even amid the vast inequalities, there was innovation, vision, and transformation. The industrial titans built the infrastructure that propelled America into the modern age: steel bridges, rail networks, telegraph lines, and urban centers that would grow to rival any in the world. They created jobs, industries, and economic systems that expanded the nation's capacity to produce and connect. For some, this represented progress, the triumph of ingenuity and ambition. For others, it was a cautionary tale of human cost, a reminder that prosperity could exist alongside suffering, that power concentrated in the hands of a few could reshape the destinies of millions without their consent or benefit. The story of wealth and power in the 1880s is a story of extremes, extraordinary achievement, and extraordinary exploitation. It is a story of lives intertwined by circumstance, whether voluntarily or by necessity, and of a nation wrestling with the tension between freedom, opportunity, and fairness. Industrial elites shaped the trajectory of America, their choices and ambitions, defining not only the economy, but the social landscape, the moral questions, and the lived experiences of countless citizens. They were architects of the modern nation, and yet the foundations upon which they built were made of human labor, resilience, and sacrifice, raising urgent questions about justice, equity, and the true cost of progress. In the 1880s, while cities roared with the noise of factories and the clamor of immigrants, rural America existed in a world both connected to the land and isolated from the wealth and power of the industrial elites. The life of a farmer was dictated by seasons, by weather, and by the soil itself, a force as unpredictable as it was unforgiving. Dawn came not as a gentle invitation, but as a signal to begin work. Fields had to be plowed, seeds sown, and crops tended, often with tools that demanded the full strength of human labor. Horses pulled plows through dense soil, their hooves pounding against the earth as sweat streamed down the faces of the men who guided them. Women worked alongside their husbands, tending gardens, caring for animals, and performing household tasks that were as exhausting as those in the fields. Children contributed as well, milking cows, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, and learning the lessons of labor before they had any chance to enjoy play. Life on the farm was intimate with nature, but relentless in its demands. Droughts could wither a crop overnight. Floods could wash away the fragile gains of months of effort. Pestilence and disease in animals threatened the stability of a family's livelihood. Fluctuating market prices determined whether a harvest would yield profit or loss. There was little room for error, and even the smallest misfortune could plunge a family into debt or despair. The land, which promised sustenance and independence, could just as easily become a source of anxiety and struggle, a constant reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Railroads, heralded as the arteries of progress, offered both hope and hardship to farmers. On one hand, the railroads connected rural communities to distant markets, allowing grain, cotton, and livestock to reach cities, ports, and international buyers. Farmers could sell their goods beyond the local economy, potentially securing higher prices than a small town might provide. On the other hand, railroads were controlled by powerful magnates who could dictate freight rates and schedules. A farmer who produced a bountiful crop could find profits eaten alive by exorbitant shipping fees. The railroads represented both opportunity and exploitation, a double-edged sword that highlighted the tension between progress and power. Debt was a near constant companion for farmers. To plant crops, purchase livestock, or invest in new equipment, many were forced to borrow money from banks or local lenders. Interest rates could be high, and repayment depended on weather, market prices, and luck. A single bad season could trap a family in a cycle of borrowing and repayment, leaving them vulnerable to foreclosure and the loss of land that had often been in the family for generations. Sharecropping, particularly in the post-Civil War South, replaced slavery with a system of perpetual indebtedness. Families who once worked as laborers on plantations now labored under a different form of bondage, tied to land they did not own and profits they rarely kept. Even in the Midwest and West, where independent farming was more common, the pressures of debt and market volatility created anxiety that permeated every decision and every day. Rural life was also shaped by isolation. Neighbors might be miles apart, and communication with the outside world was slow and limited. Social interaction often centered on churches, schools, and local markets. Education was valued but difficult to access consistently, as children were needed in the fields. The nearest doctor could be hours away, and medical care was rudimentary, leaving families to rely on home remedies and intuition. News from the cities and from national politics arrived slowly, yet it could have a profound impact on farmers' lives, influencing crop prices, trade policy, and land values. The country's economic and political decisions were often made in distant offices, yet they reached deep into the soil of the farm, shaping the possibilities for survival and prosperity. Despite these hardships, farmers exhibited resilience and ingenuity. They experimented with new crops, developed irrigation techniques, and learned to rotate fields to preserve soil fertility. They adapted to technological changes, purchasing plows, threshers, and reapers that could multiply labor efficiency, though the cost of machinery often added to the burden of debt. Communities shared knowledge, equipment, and labor, understanding that mutual aid was essential to enduring the harsh realities of agricultural life. Barn raisings, harvest festivals, and church gatherings provided moments of respite, laughter, and solidarity amid the unending work of planting, tending, and harvesting. The economic pressures on farmers created both tension and activism. Many felt that the nation's economic system was rigged against them, favoring railroads, banks, and industrial interests, while leaving those who tilled the land vulnerable. Farmers began to organize, forming alliances such as the Grange and later the Farmers Alliance, advocating for reforms in freight rates, fair lending practices, and political representation. Their struggle was not merely economic, it was also a fight for dignity and recognition in a rapidly modernizing country that often celebrated the urban industrial elite while overlooking the backbone of the nation. The men and women who worked the soil, weather, technology, and market forces intertwined in unpredictable ways. A sudden frost could destroy weeks of labor, while a drought could leave fields barren and families on the brink of starvation. Pest infestations and plant diseases threatened to undo months of toil in days. The introduction of new machinery offered promise, yet it also demanded capital and skill, reinforcing the precarious balance between survival and ruin. Every decision, from the timing of planting to the choice of crops, carried weighty consequences, and there was little room for error in a world where so many variables were beyond human control. Family life on the farm was shaped by these pressures. Roles were strictly defined but flexible when necessity demanded. Children matured quickly, learning practical skills essential for survival, while parents bore the heavy responsibility of providing food, shelter, and guidance amid constant uncertainty. Meals were often simple, made from what the land and animals could provide. Celebrations were modest, yet they reinforced bonds of community and family. Religious faith provided comfort, structure, and hope, serving as a moral compass and an emotional anchor in a life dominated by labor and uncertainty. Isolation and hardship could breed both resilience and creativity. Farmers found ways to preserve food, build durable homes, and construct barns that could withstand storms. They navigated complex economic realities, negotiating with middlemen, bankers, and merchants to extract whatever advantage they could. They adapted to technological change, political reform, and environmental challenge, understanding that survival required both physical labor and strategic thinking. Every harvest carried lessons, every setback taught endurance, and every success was hard won. Yet for all their skill and resilience, farmers were deeply aware of their vulnerability. Their lives were intertwined with forces larger than themselves: the railroads, the markets, the climate, and the policies of a government that often prioritized industrial growth over rural welfare. The burden of survival was heavy, the rewards uncertain, and the stakes enormous. Farmers of the 1880s lived with the knowledge that their labor fed cities, sustained industries, and built the nation, yet they were frequently marginalized in the economic and social hierarchies that were emerging across the country. In the 1880s, as America's cities swelled with factories and tenements, and its countryside struggled under droughts, debt, and uncertainty, a quiet but growing movement began to take shape, one that challenged the stark inequalities of wealth, labor, and opportunity. This was an era when ordinary people began to understand with increasing clarity that the promise of America was not automatically delivered to all. Workers, women, African Americans, and farmers alike began to question the systems that dictated their lives, forming unions, associations, and alliances, not out of idealism alone, but out of necessity. Survival demanded organization, and survival demanded a voice. Resistance was not always dramatic. It often took the form of small, steady, persistent acts, each one a declaration that injustice would not be tolerated silently. Laborers in the Indus Trial cities were among the first to assert themselves. They had spent long hours in factories, mills, and mines, enduring unsafe conditions, exhausting workdays, and wages that barely allowed them to feed their families. The toll on body and spirit was immense, yet the growing awareness of collective power transformed despair into action. Labor unions began to form, some local and informal, others national and organized, providing workers with a platform to demand shorter hours, fair wages, and safer conditions. Strikes emerged as a tool of resistance, a way to demonstrate the indispensability of labor to the nation's industrial engine. Sometimes these strikes were peaceful, consisting of walkouts and negotiations, but more often they erupted into confrontations with factory owners, police, and private security forces. Violence was common, whether from scabs crossing picket lines or bullets fired at demonstrators. Yet these moments were defining, illustrating the willingness of ordinary Americans to fight for dignity, even in the face of overwhelming power. Child labor also became a focal point of reformers. The sight of boys and girls working long hours in factories, mills, and mines stirred growing concern among social activists. They argued that childhood was being stolen, education neglected, and health destroyed for the sake of profit. Campaigns began to call for legislation to limit hours, establish minimum working ages, and ensure that children had access to schooling. Although change was slow and inconsistent, the very act of advocacy marked a shift in societal consciousness, an acknowledgement that labor was not merely an economic necessity, but a moral and social responsibility. Women played a central role in early reform movements. Beyond the factories and homes where they worked tirelessly, women organized societies and clubs dedicated to social improvement, temperance, and suffrage. They demanded access to education, the right to vote, and participation in public life, insisting that their experiences, skills, and perspectives mattered in shaping a fairer society. Women's activism intertwined with labor movements as they fought for better working conditions in textile mills and garment shops, campaigned for child welfare, and pushed for housing reform in overcrowded tenements. These early efforts laid the groundwork for future legal and social reforms, demonstrating that resistance could take both public and private forms, from lobbying and petitions to marches and demonstrations. African Americans newly emancipated from slavery just a few decades prior faced a particularly brutal landscape of injustice. Reconstruction had promised freedom and equality. But by the 1880s, Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, and racial violence threatened to undo those gains. African Americans in the South were often confined to sharecropping arrangements, tied to landowners through cycles of debt that mimicked slavery in practice, if not in law. In cities, segregation limited access to housing, education, and employment. Yet, African Americans resisted in ways both subtle and profound. Families invested in schools, churches, and businesses, creating institutions that preserved dignity, culture, and autonomy. Leaders and activists began advocating for civil rights, education, and political engagement, insisting that the promises of freedom be made real despite systemic barriers. Resistance was not always dramatic. It was in the quiet persistence of communities building schools, maintaining libraries, and fostering literacy and opportunity that social justice found its roots. Farmers, too, became vocal in their struggle for fairness. Confronted with high railroad fees, unpredictable crop prices, and limited political influence, they organized collectively, forming groups like the Grange and the Farmers Alliance. These organizations advocated for policies that would alleviate debt, regulate railroads, and provide cooperative purchasing and marketing opportunities. Farmers' resistance highlighted the interconnection between economic survival and political power, demonstrating that social justice was not only a matter of moral argument, but also practical necessity. They sought to redefine the rules that governed their lives, insisting that progress and prosperity should not be reserved for cities or industrial elites alone, but shared across the nation. The press, literature, and public speeches became tools of advocacy and consciousness raising. Newspapers reported strikes, accidents, and abuses, bringing the reality of industrial and rural hardship to broader audiences. Writers and reformers described conditions in tenements and factories with vivid, often shocking detail, appealing to the moral sensibilities of the public. Public lectures and political debates provided forums for discussion, education, and mobilization, connecting disparate groups in the pursuit of common goals. The rise of social reform was fueled by the dissemination of information, the spreading of stories that humanized those who labored and struggled, and the insistence that their voices could no longer be ignored. Resistance also took legal and legislative forms. Reformers began lobbying for regulations on labor, housing, sanitation, and education. Early attempts at child labor laws, factory inspections, and public health initiatives reflected a growing recognition that government had a role in safeguarding citizens from exploitation and neglect. Women's suffrage movements sought constitutional change. Labor unions sought legal protections for workers, and African American leaders advocated for the enforcement of civil rights. Each of these efforts represented a challenge to the status quo, a refusal to accept injustice as inevitable, and a belief that collective action could reshape society. Cultural shifts accompanied these movements. The growing awareness of inequality and exploitation influenced art, literature, and social attitudes. Photographs of tenements and factory floors, essays describing poverty and labor, and novels depicting the lives of the marginalized contributed to a national conversation about justice, fairness, and human dignity. Resistance was thus not only practical and political, but also symbolic, an attempt to reshape the narrative of the nation and expand the imagination of what America could and should be. The 1880s marked the beginning of a larger awakening in American society. Ordinary people, workers, women, immigrants, African Americans, and farmers began to see themselves as actors in their own history, capable of demanding change. Resistance was expressed in strikes, petitions, clubs, and associations. It was found in acts of solidarity, in community building, and in the insistence that exploitation, inequality, and neglect were not immutable. Social justice began as a series of small, determined efforts, each one building upon another, creating momentum that would shape decades of reform to come. In this era of industrialization, immigration, and rapid economic change, the cries for social justice were often met with opposition, violence, and indifference, yet they persisted. They demonstrated that even in the harshest conditions, humanity could assert itself, challenge power, and demand dignity. They illuminated the tensions between wealth and labor, freedom and oppression, and the ideal of opportunity versus the reality of hardship. Resistance in the 1880s laid the foundation for the movements that would follow: providing lessons about courage, solidarity, and the enduring human belief that society can and must be made more just. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and sub Cribs.